Karen sat in her kitchen at 9 p.m., surrounded by the remnants of her campaign, stacks of unused flyers, her measuring tape, and the infamous evidence binder that had consumed 2 months of her life. Dave sat across from her, bank statements spread between them like a paper barrier. $3,000, Karen. His voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than if he'd been yelling. $3,000 for a volunteer position that you didn't even win. I know. Karen's voice was barely a whisper. I know, and I'm sorry. Are you, though? Dave looked up from the bank statement. Because this isn't just about the money. You've become someone I don't recognize. The words hit harder than Karen expected. She looked around her kitchen, really looked, and saw it through Dave's eyes. Violation reports organized by severity, a calendar marked with neighbors' lawn care schedules, and a whiteboard listing problem properties ranked by number of infractions. When did I become the neighborhood villain? She asked, more to herself than to Dave. A soft knock at the door interrupted the heavy silence. Dave got up to answer it, and Karen heard familiar voices, the Hendersons, the Garcias, Mrs. Patterson, and others. We came to check on Karen, she heard Sarah Henderson say. Is she okay? Karen felt tears prick her eyes. After months of treating these people like adversaries, they were showing up at her door with concern. Dave led them into the kitchen, and Karen found herself facing a small crowd of neighbors she'd spent the better part of 2 months antagonizing. We'd heard about the election results, Jim Henderson said gently. We wanted you to know. It wasn't personal. It was personal, Karen said quietly. I made it personal. I turned you all into enemies when you were just living your lives. Mrs. Patterson, who had been clutching her purse tighter every time she saw Karen for weeks, stepped forward. Dear, we know you care about the neighborhood. That's not a bad thing. But caring and controlling aren't the same thing, added Maria Garcia, whose wind chime had been the subject of Karen's latest crusade. Margaret Chen appeared in the doorway, looking tired but determined. Karen, the board met tonight. We have a proposition for you. Karen looked up, surprised. A proposition? We want to create a new position. Community Standards Coordinator. It would be a paid position, not much, but enough to cover your campaign expenses over time. You want to hire me? Karen couldn't hide her confusion. After everything I've done. Tom Rodriguez stepped forward. Your attention to detail is impressive. Overwhelming, but impressive. The neighborhood could use someone who notices problems before they become major issues. But, Margaret held up a finger, it would come with mandatory training on community relations and conflict resolution. Dave squeezed Karen's hand under the table. What do you think? Karen looked around the room at her neighbors, people she'd measured, documented, and criticized, who were now offering her a chance at redemption. I think, she said slowly, I have a lot to learn about being a good neighbor. Sarah Henderson smiled. We all do. That's what makes it a community. As the neighbors began to leave, each offering words of encouragement and forgiveness, Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. But as the door closed behind the last neighbor, Karen noticed something through her window that made her pulse quicken. The Johnsons had installed a new fence, and unless she was mistaken, it was at least 2 inches over the property line. She caught herself reaching for her measuring tape, then stopped. Tomorrow, she decided she'd knock on their door and have a conversation like a neighbor, not a compliance officer. Though she did make a mental note to double-check the fence regulations, just in case. Old habits, after all, die hard. Karen Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, binoculars pressed against her eyes like a suburban sniper, watching the Hendersons' backyard pool party unfold with the intensity of a military surveillance operation. The sight of inflatable flamingos bobbing innocently in the water made her blood pressure spike to dangerous levels. That's a pink flamingo, she shrieked into her phone, startling her husband Dave so badly he dropped his sandwich. Section 4.7 of the HOA guidelines clearly states all pool accessories must be in earth tones or neutral colors. What Karen didn't realize was that she'd accidentally called the emergency HOA hotline instead of the regular complaint number. triggering an automated alert that sent 3 board members racing to Maple Grove Lane thinking there was a genuine crisis. 20 minutes later, HOA President Margaret Chen stood on Karen's doorstep, slightly out of breath and visibly annoyed. "Karen, you can't keep using the emergency line for flamingo violations." Emergency. Karen's perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up. "Margaret, that pool is a beacon of non-compliance. Look at it." She thrust her binoculars toward Margaret. "Count the violations yourself." Margaret reluctantly peered through the binoculars. The Hendersons had indeed committed several minor infractions. The aforementioned pink flamingo, a blue pool noodle, should be beige, and Karen's personal favorite discovery, a small inflatable unicorn that was clearly visible from the street. "I'll send them a notice," Margaret sighed. "A notice?" Karen's voice cracked like a teenage boy's. "Margaret, they're destroying the very fabric of our community. Property values are plummeting as we speak." Dave emerged from the kitchen, still holding his rescued sandwich. "Honey, the Hendersons are nice people. Maybe we could just—" "David." Karen's tone could have frozen the Hendersons' pool solid. "Whose side are you on?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dave had learned over their 15-year marriage that there were only 2 sides in Karen's world, hers and everyone else's. He wisely retreated to the garage. Margaret checked her watch. "I have to go. Real emergencies await." As Margaret walked toward her car, Karen called out, "I'm running for the HOA board next month." Margaret stopped dead in her tracks. The announcement hit the quiet street like a bomb. Mrs. Patterson across the street dropped her watering can. Even the Hendersons' music seemed to lower a decibel. "You're what now?" Margaret turned around slowly. Karen straightened her shoulders, her decision crystallizing in that moment. She hadn't planned to run. The words had simply erupted from her mouth like a geyser of righteous indignation. But now that she'd said it, the idea felt perfect, inevitable even. "You heard me. Someone needs to restore order to this neighborhood, and clearly that someone is me." Margaret's face went through several expressions before settling on something between disbelief and horror. "Karen, being on the HOA board isn't about. It's about standards, Margaret. Standards that are clearly slipping under current management." The gauntlet was thrown. War had been declared over a pink flamingo, and Karen Whitmore was leading the charge. Karen's HOA board campaign began at 6 a.m. sharp with the systematic distribution of flyers that looked more like manifestos than election materials. Each bright yellow sheet bore the slogan, "Restore Dignity to Maple Grove," in bold, aggressive font that seemed to shout from every mailbox. "Honey, maybe tone it down a bit," Day suggested over breakfast, reading one of her flyers. "Point number 12 says you'll institute mandatory weekly lawn inspections with photographic documentation. And what's wrong with that?" Karen snapped, aggressively buttering her toast. "The Johnson's grass is 3/4 of an inch too long. I measured." Day stared at his wife, wondering when exactly she'd become this person. The Karen he'd married had been particular, yes, but this new version seemed to operate on a different frequency entirely. The doorbell rang, and Karen practically sprinted to answer it. Margaret Chen stood there with 2 other board members, their expressions grim. "We need to talk," Margaret said. They settled in Karen's living room, where she'd already prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled "The Decline of Maple Grove, a Visual Journey." The first slide showed a garbage can that was positioned 2 inches too far from the curb. "Karen," began board member Tom Rodriguez, "your campaign materials are causing some concern." "Concern?" Karen clicked to slide 2, a dandelion growing in the Pattle's front yard. "The only concerning thing is how far we've let standards slip. You've received 17 noise complaints this week alone," said the third board member, Janet Willis. "Noise complaints?" Karen's voice pitched higher. "I was conducting necessary community education." What Karen didn't mention was that her community education involved using a megaphone at 7 a.m. to point out various violations from her front lawn. The Hendersons had finally moved their pink flamingo, but only after Karen had staged what she called a peaceful observation vigil in their front yard for 3 hours. Karen, Margaret leaned forward. Running for the board is your right, but you can't harass residents during your campaign. Harass? Karen's eyes flashed dangerously. I prefer proactive community engagement. Tom pulled out his phone and began reading. Mrs. Whitmore knocked on our door at 6:30 am to inform us that our garden gnome was an aesthetic abomination. When we didn't answer, she left a 47-page document detailing the historical and cultural problems with lawn ornaments. The research was thorough, Karen said defensively. Janet looked exhausted. She measured the Hendersons' mailbox with a ruler during their daughter's birthday party and announced to the entire party that it was criminally non-compliant. Dave, who had been quietly listening from the kitchen doorway, finally spoke up. Maybe we could discuss this privately. No, Karen stood up abruptly. There's nothing private about community standards. If you're not willing to enforce the rules we all agree to, then maybe it's time for new leadership. The room fell silent. Outside, a lawnmower started up, and Karen automatically glanced toward the window to assess whether it was being operated within acceptable noise ordinance hours. Margaret gathered her papers. The election is in 2 weeks, Karen. Until then, please try to remember that your neighbors are people, not violations waiting to be discovered. After they left, Karen stood in her living room, surrounded by her campaign materials and evidence folders. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across her face. Had she gone too far? Then she spotted something through her window. The Garcias had hung a wind chime that was clearly 3 inches larger than regulation size. The doubt vanished. Her mission was righteous, and she would not be deterred. Election day arrived with all the tension of a medieval siege. Karen had positioned herself at the community center entrance at 6 am, armed with a clipboard and measuring tape, and what she called her final evidence portfolio, a 3-ring binder containing 847 photographs of neighborhood violations. Good morning, Mrs. Patterson. Karen chirped as her elderly neighbor approached the voting entrance. Don't forget to vote for accountability. Mrs. Patterson clutched her purse tighter and hurried past without making eye contact. The voting process was supposed to be anonymous and peaceful. What actually happened was that Karen had somehow obtained a folding table and was conducting what she called exit interviews to gauge voter sentiment. Excuse me, Mr. Rodriguez. No relation to board member Tom. Could you share your thoughts on the current state of sidewalk maintenance in Quadrant 3? By noon, Margaret Chen had received 14 complaints about Karen's polling practices. She arrived at the community center to find Karen had constructed an elaborate display board showing before and after photos of various property violations, complete with dramatic arrows and time-stamped documentation. Karen, you can't campaign at the polling location, Margaret said, approaching the display. I'm not campaigning, Karen replied innocently. I'm providing educational materials about community standards. You have a banner that says Vote Karen F4OEA. Karen glanced at her banner as if seeing it for the first time. That's merely informational. The confrontation might have escalated, but at that moment, something unprecedented happened. The Hendersons approached Karen's table. Mrs. Whitmore, said Jim Henderson, we wanted to talk to you. Karen straightened, prepared for battle. If this is about the flamingo incident, it's not. Jim's wife Sarah stepped forward. We wanted to thank you. Karen blinked. I'm sorry. The pink flamingo, Sarah continued. We've been meaning to replace it for months. It was faded and tacky, but we just never got around to it. Your intervention finally motivated us to buy something we actually liked. Karen stared at them, her prepared defense speech dissolving. You're thanking me. And the garden cleanup suggestions you left, Jim added. Some of them were actually helpful. Our property looks better now. This was not in Karen's playbook. She prepared for hostility, resistance, even legal challenges. Gratitude was completely foreign territory. Well, standards are important, she stammered. They are, Sarah agreed. But so is community. Maybe there's a way to have both? The conversation was interrupted by Tom Rodriguez's arrival. Karen, We need to discuss your campaign expenditures. Expenditures? Karen frowned. What expenditures? Tom held up a receipt. The measuring tape rental, the professional photography services for violation documentation, the laminated signs. Karen's face went pale. In her crusade for perfection, she'd spent over $3,000 of her and Dave's money. Money they'd been saving for a vacation. Oh no, she whispered, the reality hitting her like a cold wave. Dave's going to kill me. As if summoned by her fear, Dave appeared in the community center doorway. His expression was unreadable, but Karen could see the disappointment in his eyes. The voting closed at 6 p.m. Karen sat in her car in the parking lot, staring at her phone, afraid to go home and face the financial conversation awaiting her. At 7 p.m., Margaret called with the results. Karen had lost by 3 votes. 3 votes. After all the measuring tapes, the megaphone announcements, the 47-page documents, she'd lost by 3 votes.